Hello, my name is Dr. Jonathan White, and I'm a professor of sociology and political economy at Bridgewater State University in Massachusetts, and a longtime friend and board member of Free the Children. Today I wanted to speak about an issue that I'm passionate about and that I know so many people are passionate about, and it's the issue of child labor. What is a child laborer? What types of labor does a child laborer do? How do they become child laborers? And importantly, what can we all do to put an end to child labor? Let's start by defining child labor. What is a child laborer? Well, according to the UN definition, a child laborer is any child underneath the age of 18 who's working long hours on a regular basis or suffering abusive treatment, and importantly, who has no or poor access to education. That is to say that in some way the child's work as a child laborer is pulling them away from their right, their human right, their children's right to an education. Today there are around 215 million child laborers around the world. 215 million children who live a very different life than when we think of or conceptualize childhood. Not the life of waking up, going to school, having weekends, going to camp, living the life of a Western childhood. Instead, they wake up and their life is a life of labor. And it's often brutal, hazardous work. In fact, about 115 million of all of the child laborers around the world are children who are working in the most hazardous conditions. That's about half of all child laborers who are working under a classification of hazardous child labor. Of these, about 74 million of them are boys and 41 million of them are girls. Of all child laborers, in fact, about half of all child laborers work full-time, which is an incredible thing to think about. Just stop and think about the life of an average Western youth in a developed country, and then think about the life of a child laborer who half of them work full-time. A sad outcome, a sad fact, is that about 22,000 child laborers die every year in their acts of child labor. When we look at child labor, we oftentimes break it into two major categories. There's legal child labor and there's illegal child labor. Legal child labor is familiar to us. Legal child labor is having a paper route, working in a mom and pop store or in your parents' store after school, having a summer job. All the kinds of labor that we've come to know are legal, are fair to kids, and actually even encourage their development. More importantly, when we're looking at child labor though, we look at illegal child labor. In fact, those numbers that I just gave to you, the 215 million child laborers, the 115 million children who are working in the most hazardous conditions, all 215 million of them fall under the category of illegal child labor. So this is who we speak of when we speak of child labor. Illegal child labor means that in some way or other, the child laboring is taking them away from their right to an education. Because of their labor, they're not going to school. Because of their labor, they're not having enough time in school. They're being pulled out of school. And it is a right of a child to get an education. When we speak of illegal child labor, we speak of kids many times who are working with very dangerous situations, working in the coal mines, working with machinery that's not safe for them, working with machinery that in some way or other poses an imminent and immediate risk to them, as seen in the 22,000 child laborers who die every year. And any other form of child labor that denies a child her or his right is also, of course, considered an illegal form of child labor. Inside this category of illegal child labor is something that we call the worst forms of child labor. These are the kids who are working in the most imminent danger. These are the kids whose rights are being most violated. Of these, about 60% work in agricultural industries. We may think of agriculture and farming as kind of a nice pastime, kind of a fairly easy thing to do, but it's not. Think of the machinery out in agricultural areas. And I think oftentimes we have a picture of the small family farm, but think of these kids who are taken away from their families or who are in some way brought forward to these big agribusinesses, these huge, huge farms. And their jobs are dangerous. They're working with machinery that kids should not be working with. Oftentimes in the sugarcane fields, for instance, they're using machetes, and many kids chop off their fingers, chop off their hands, get into all kinds of accidents. Little kids in high sugarcane fields, sometimes kids as young as 5, 6, and 7. And these are kids who are working in the worst forms of child labor because they're in imminent danger. Another form of the worst form of child labor is slavery. There are 27 million slaves around the world today. It's funny because overall, most people, when surveys are done, at least in the United States, most people believe that slavery across the world has been abolished for years. In fact, there are 27 million slaves around the world, and of those, half of them, about 13 million, are children. 13 million child slaves around the world working in the cocoa industry, in the coffee picking industry, in the sugarcane industry, and many other industries such as the carpet industry where they are simply slaves. Two more forms of the worst forms of illegal child labor are some of the most appalling, objectionable human rights violations facing our world today. One is the issue of child prostitution, children being used by adults for sexual purposes. Oftentimes these kids are trafficked, that is to say that they're kind of stolen from where they live, trafficked, moved to another area of the country, or even oftentimes to another country. And here they kind of live in brothels or chatels where they end up being used as child prostitutes. Mostly it's girl children, but more and more we're seeing boy children as well. And the other form that's the worst form of child labor that's incredibly despicable, of course, is child soldiers. There are 300,000 child soldiers around the world fighting wars in nearly 30 countries, in Africa and Asia and Latin America, and sometimes even in Western countries. And these kids are often even on the front lines. These are kids carrying around guns, shooting guns, killing people. And there are about 300,000 child soldiers around the world today, a clearly horrendous form of child labor. Another reason why adults would use children is because children have small hands. When you think of sweatshops and looms, making products like carpets and rugs, making products like clothing and garments, kids have very small hands. Why is that an advantage? Well, in a sewing machine, kids can get in and sew much faster and quicker because their hands are more agile. On something like carpets, what makes a carpet expensive is a hand-woven, hand-sewn carpet. If it's hand-stitched, it's worth more than if it's machine-stitched. And if the stitches are small, it's worth more than if the stitches are big. And the reason is because small stitches will hold the rug together better, so it'll last longer. So it's a higher quality. Smaller stitches, smaller hands, smaller fingers. Smaller fingers, you do the math. These are children making carpets. And so one of the reasons that adults like to use kids is because of their physicality. And there's many other reasons that adults would employ kids in child labor. But what is pushing kids into child labor? And that is a question that we are so interested in. It's intensely compelling to us because if we can figure this piece out, we have a much better chance of reducing and eventually eliminating child labor, and particularly the worst forms of child labor. The most important, the biggest cause of child labor is poverty. Kids who are poor, their families need them to in some way contribute to the income of the family. And oftentimes that poverty makes them vulnerable to those who would employ them. Illiteracy. Oftentimes families, kids haven't had a formal education, and sometimes an employer will come around to town and say, hey, sign this contract so your kid can work with me after school a couple hours a day. And families trust, they sign that contract, and it turns out what they signed, because they couldn't read it, because they're illiterate, like the 1 billion people around the world who are illiterate, it turns out that they signed a contract that signed their kids away into slavery or indentured servitude. Kids are also vulnerable, frankly, because of you and I, because we as consumers keep and continue to demand lower and lower and lower prices, and those who produce are in search of lower and lower priced labor. So as we as consumers have a bit to do with a big piece in this puzzle. Of course, there's lots of solutions. Every time we identify what the catalyst is for the problem, we're also, in a sense, identifying what some of the solutions are. It would take an estimated $760 billion, which sounds like a lot of money, but it would take an estimated $760 billion to eradicate child labor over the next 20 years by investing in education and water and food and microdevelopment projects. And it sounds like a lot of money, but just think about how much the world spent just this year on war, on military, on fighting and killing. If we invested just a small percentage of that into ending child labor, over the next 20 years we could eradicate this horrible social problem. And in fact, if we were to do that, we would find a $4 trillion return, because kids' health, kids' education, kids' abilities to move their communities forward would have increased, and moving forward they'll have a much better chance for their own ability to thrive in their communities. Some other solutions, most importantly, are education and awareness. I urge you, I beg you, go learn more about child labor. Teach other people about child labor. Watch videos on child labor, read reports on child labor, and have sessions where you teach people about child labor. We can be cautious as well about our consumer choices. What are we wearing? Is my shirt connected to child labor? Is it connected to the type of labor that I wouldn't feel comfortable with? Free the Children has its own line of clothing called Me to We Style. Those are ethically sourced, good for the environment, no use of child labor at all, my goodness, no. In fact, paying a more than fair and living wage to adult workers. There's alternatives out there to our consumer choices. And finally, what we really need to do to end child labor, and it's been a long journey of kind of coming to an understanding of the most important piece, the most important peg in trying to end child labor, is to build schools that are affordable in regions where kids right now either don't have access to school or can't afford to go to those schools. Free the Children is doing incredible work along these lines. We've built over 650 schools around the world, and when kids come to these schools and they get a meal and they learn to read and they get skills, their communities start to build up and up and up, and it decreases the risk of them becoming child laborers, and it decreases the cycle of poverty, and ultimately child labor is an issue that every single one of us is connected to in various ways, as we are with all of the solutions.